let's think about a different scenario. Scenario we're going to think about is right now we actually are loading all of the information for our foods. We're just showing it depending upon the route switching. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, there were two endpoints. There was one for the list of foods, and every time you wanted to get an individual foo, you had to make another call to the server. So we could simulate that. One way to simulate that would be we're going to switch this out a little bit, and we're going to switch this to a class. Because if we are going to have to make a call when this happens, then what we're going to do is we're going to have to deal with state, and we're going to have to deal with the life cycle method. So let's see how we could end up doing this. This is going to be our class, and this really is going to end up being our render method. And let's pull this out because this is going to be a little bit of a different ball game here. First of all, this is going to be our render method. And we're going to modify it a little bit so that in our render method, let's assume that we have some constructor. And what we're going to put on our constructor is we're going to obviously call super because we have to call super. And on our state, we're going to specify, now again, assuming that there's some details that we need to get here, on our state, we're going to have a foo. And we're going to end up populating this foo, but we're going to have to get this data when our component mounts and also when it ends up updating. So what we could sort of simulate here is let's go over here and let's just be a little bit defensive and we'll say, hey, look, if not foo.id, if you didn't go and get the details for that particular foo, we're just going to return null because we're not really going to have whatever information. And we'll put here some detail that doesn't actually exist at this point. And this shouldn't end up breaking anything, although it looks like it did. Let's take a quick look here. Foo is not defined. That's right, because we're going to get this foo from this dot state. And so now we've got our foos, but we're never going to end up getting some foos detail. We could simulate it by going over here and say component did mount. And when the component ends up mounting, if we wanted to go over here, we could do this set timeout just to simulate that we were going up to the server and say that, hey, look, after about a half a second, we're going to just pretend that we've got a new foo. Let's give it an ID, and we're just going to simulate this by saying, hey, look, this is going to be this dot props dot match params.id, because that's the only way we make it in here. We'll multiply it by 1 since it's going to be an integer. And for the detail here, we'll just simulate this by saying detail for foo with ID of, and let's actually separate this out. So we'll say ID is this props match params ID times 1. Put the ID here. And go over here and put in the ID. And again, nothing's going to happen here. This shouldn't end up breaking anything. Let's just see if it doesn't. And again, this set timeout. That's right. It's not this set timeout. It's window timeout, which is just a global object. Again, nothing's going to change here. But if we went over here and we said this, set state foo, we could refresh, and after half a second, we would see a change. Now notice, when I click on the link here, I don't end up seeing the change. And this is where we have to look at the advanced lifecycle method. And we have to be careful. This really only happens when you have a situation where you're setting states, your component is already mounted, And what you need to look at here is not the component did mount, but the component did update. So one of the things that we'll see here is that when the component updates, let's do a console.log, and we'll say this props match params ID. Let's just see what happens here. So when we click here, when our component updates, so we've got our foo, and I spelled that wrong, apologize. Component did update. So now, when I click over here, I will see the update. And again, if I wanted to simulate that, again, we'll simulate it the same way by going over here and putting this in. But I'm going to run into a bit of a problem here. And the problem that I'm going to run into is, yeah, I'm going to have the new params. But if I refresh this and I click over here, and seemingly it looks like it's working. All right, I click over here. I click over here. It seems to work. But one thing you might not realize under the covers is this is constantly going to be updating. I'll see that this just continually ends up updating. Now, if we were making a call to a server, this would be a little bit problematic because it would keep on making the call to the server. Why is that happening? Because what we're doing is that when the component updates, we're changing the state again. So one thing we want to do is be a little bit defensive here by going in here and saying, hey, look, if the props ended up changing, we only care when the parameters end up changing. And luckily, component update gives us previous props. So to avoid this problem that's going on here, now we've got, this would have been 224 calls to another server, which you really would want to avoid. You really take a server down doing that. What we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, look, we only want to run this update if the previous props params ID is not equal to this dot props params ID. So it's only going to end up running when the value ends up changing. And even though it'll end up coming in here again, it won't keep on updating the state, which is really causing that infinite loop. So now if I go to refresh this, and this is going to be previous props match params ID, this dot props match params ID. And now if I click over here, and again, just to see that this is not infinitely updating, if I do a console.log, updating, I'll see that it'll update, but again, it's just updating one time per click. And again, it's really important because you don't want to get into a position where when your component updates, you continually end up setting the state, and that's what will end up causing this infinite loop. And again, if you were making API calls, this would be very problematic. So here, whenever you're using this advanced lifecycle method, you always want to be defensive about using it.